That means the gas demand will be increasing. Again, this part will be very important to our economy. So we need to find alternative fuel rather than gas to run our business. The other perspective that people think, we, a MENA region, now it's not Oman so much, we as a MENA region, we have a merit of renewable energy source, and perhaps we have a little bit of challenge when it comes to water. If we map it and say, okay, after 20 years from now, if we just take the similar assumption like the renewable energy will be the same price or maybe cheaper, the water technology development will be cheaper, then perhaps we could ask another question, who could produce hydrogen cheaper than MENA region? Then the answer might be, we have really 90% or less, or around that range, that we could lead this sector again by empowering our diversification of economy by relying on hydrogen.
I'm going to come back to you on that water piece shortly. But first, I want to make sure we go through a conversation with all the panelists. I want to bring in Nora, though, because there is a perspective that needs to evolve out of the discussion of hydrogen. So if oil and gas producers are going to have a key role in the future, of that dialogue of having more than just thinking green in the sense of solar farms, wind farms, and the like. So could you comment on that?
Absolutely. I think the first thing to note, and this is picking up on what Sarah mentioned, I think it's not so much about fair share. I think when we look at a lot of GCC countries, it's this huge appetite to show leadership. Outside of whether or not it is our responsibility. I think a lot of countries within the region, GCC, I speak, for example, on behalf of the Kingdom, with its recent net zero announcement, with its updated NDC, with its different initiatives under the Saudi and Middle East Green Initiative, you see this shift in terms of appetite, and I think this is the huge opportunity, regardless of whether or not the fair share discussion applies within this context. And I think to answer your question, Steve, and I'll discuss a bit about what also our colleague from Oman mentioned, the CCE, of course, presents you with a menu of options. So when you're looking from a diversification perspective, the more options you have, the more likely you are to be successful. So this is really the idea behind the CCE, is to have more things that can create stability and reliability within your system. So if you can electrify, then that's where the renewable energy and can play a huge role. If efficiency is effective, then you can do efficiency at a very large scale. But when we're looking at competitive, and this is where the green agenda comes in, if you're looking at competitive industries, which already generate a significant amount of revenue, in order to make this compatible with sustainability, you need to think about how you can manage those emissions as opposed to completely restructuring the economic structure. And this is where the abatement and removal elements of the CCE come in. And to make a note on the hydrogen as well, I think one of the most important things and opportunities for the region is to design and to design the national policies in a manner that aligns with national strengths as well. And this was mentioned briefly. Within the region, we have abundance of hydrocarbons, but we also have an abundance of solar capabilities, even wind in some regions. When it comes to hydrogen and the storage component that is needed, for example, for blue hydrogen, within the Kingdom at least, we have huge geological storage capacities. So this makes us very well suited for the production of clean hydrogen more broadly. When it comes to renewables, we've even broken records for lowest cost of renewables. So even from the perspective of cost of the electricity, it's also very competitive. So I think these are definitely considerations which would support any kind of shift to greener technologies. I think perhaps two important elements as well. In order to get everyone on board, you need to have a domestic governance and structure that is locally compatible and is appealing and incentivizes the necessary entities, which is something that was also mentioned. For example, within the kingdom with the Saudi Green Initiative, this is an initiative under the leadership of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. So this provides the vision at a national level. So the political signal is there for everyone to come on board. And then from an implementation perspective, it's divided between us and the Ministry of Energy on matters relating to emissions reduction, and then with the Ministry of Environment on matters relating to plantation or protected lands. And in addition to those elements of division of labor, we also announced that we would host the Saudi Green Initiative on an annual basis. So this already creates sort of like an ambition loop at the national level, which gives the entities the incentive to prepare something that they can announce within the upcoming event. So it creates this kind of excitement year-long. And perhaps the last element I wanted to mention on perhaps regional level, initiatives and forums such as the Middle East Green Initiative also provide that forum at a leadership level to send those political signals. And the initiatives that come out from a knowledge transfer perspective can also help us share within the context of regional challenges and opportunities.
Thank you. That's quite a bit. And I fully agree. I think the region here, something special about it is there is a strong will to show the leadership in this important transition and make sure that all forms of energy are included in how we think about going towards sustainability. I think that is critically important. And it leads me to the thought of how we go about this transition more tactically. And we haven't forgotten about Manjeet. She's at the end, but sometimes we save the best for last. So she's definitely a key part of our conversation today. It's why we're coming to a few key points around social justice and social acceptance of transition. We talked to Manjeet. So Manjeet, I wanted to get your perspective on how, if we're going to go through this transition, we're taking all these considerations into play. How do we raise public awareness in supporting this low carbon transition? Because if we don't have social acceptance, then nothing's going to happen. We have to have the people behind what we want to do from the government side. So can you tell us about your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Steve, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm from India, which is a consuming economy. You're all producing economies, so I have a different perspective. First, we use our energy very carefully because we really pay for it. We are 80% importers, so in any case, India is, and Indians are very careful. Because we have a very small tax-paying base, the government keeps petrol prices high, and everybody, it's a tax on everybody, but people use it very carefully. So to begin with, we are careful about it. Secondly, India is a champion recycler because we've really been in an economy which is not a supply economy. We've always had a shortage. Everybody recycles everything. So in some sense, the public is already involved in a saving mode as such. Now what has happened, because of our big infrastructure build-out, we've got metros coming up across the country, etc. The public acceptance is two things. One is everybody is building. These are not new cities. In India, everything is an old city, and you have to build over it. It's a little bit like trying to build a new subway running across New York City. I mean, there'd be hell to pay. So, but if you've got new cities, it's easier to do it and plan. And we don't have, ever since the Brits left, we really don't have urban planners because the politics have started to play a very important role in people's lives, right? Because people at the very bottom need a voice, and there are large numbers of them. And so the politics have helped people rise up the ladder. It's all been very good, but now we have this, these big infrastructure projects. It's been ramroded down our throats, and the government has not, because it's so urgent now, there's not really a place for public participation, so it's really left to the elite to bring the rest of the communities in there and start fighting with them. And part of it is public messaging is very, very key. Now, we have a very good leadership. We've got a prime minister who's able to communicate very well with ordinary people. So when he says something, there's a lot of acceptance. But by and large, when you get municipal corporations or state-level bureaucrats or politicians trying to tell people that they have to accept a new electrification project or a new form of transport which is electricity-based, but it's going to ruin your life until it comes about, the public messaging has become very important. So I think without the public messaging and the public acceptance, you can't really make this work very well. So that's one example. The second, I know because the new metro in Mumbai is, the terminus is in front of me. And we're finding we're a large group of communities, and you know, in Bombay, your high-rise and slum is right next to each other, and everybody's lives are completely intertwined. So there's no separation of them and us. We're all in it together. And so we have a large community that fights on a daily basis with the metro people because we want our gardens back. And here's an example of what we did. The metro was going to help us because it's electricity-based, save on petrol, but it was going to destroy all the gardens in our area. So luckily, the Japanese, JICA, is one of the funders. And so we went straight to JICA because they have rules, you cannot destroy the gardens. And so as a community, we went to them and we helped to save the gardens. Now this is a constant tug. You know, how do we preserve our public green spaces with modernizing our situation, with conservation? You know, how do we do all this? And one of the things that, especially in poorer countries, and South Asia, I would say in particular, conservation is a very, very big thing. And I don't hear a lot of people talking conservation these days. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen and, you know, new kinds of materials to use for electrification, but no one talks conservation, and that's very important. This morning there was a conversation about demand-side management, and we need to have more of that because the public is, in our part of the world, the public is not, we don't have a lot, and so conserving comes naturally. And I think that is a big part of managing a public acceptance.
That's good. I mean, it's a very important message. When you think about these big policy buckets in which we can start to shape the way in which we move our energy system, so much to talk about standards and regulations and those kind of top-down measures. Financial and economic incentives are clear, but the messaging. How do you get people to buy in and engage and understand and really want to be part of the solution set, which could have massive impacts on conservation? Something that would be the simplest form of creating sustainability. Just use things less if you don't have to waste, right? And I think that's a very nice message, and it's something that gives us a broader context. I want to stay with you, though, on your line of thinking and talk about the interdisciplinary research community. You've spent time thinking about this in a deep way, so can you tell us a little bit about how you see the interdisciplinary research community advancing the positive view between economic development and energy consumption and sustainability? It's something I know that's been in your sights for some time.
Well, you know, we sit very much in a part of the world that is struggling, right? You've got India, which got its own issues. Pakistan has had flood. Bangladesh has got also the delta region of the Ganges. Nepal is having a problem because China is damming the rivers. I mean, we're really in a bad state in terms of climate change and man-made change that we are trying to struggle with development at the same time. What we really need is cheap and reliable energy. And there's so much talk about getting rid of coal that it's, I mean, I'm going to reiterate this message. It is problematic. The coal is necessary, it's cheap, and you transition into the petrol and then you transition into renewables. You can't just jump into a renewable when it's so expensive. The very much mentioned in this conference, and I'm so happy to hear it mentioned so often, that really the countries that have created the problems, the climate finance pledges have not been made. You can't think about having a policy unless you have money. You can't work on it. And even when the COPs take place, so I'm just veering off topic a little bit. I remember during Copenhagen, we had India's representative to Copenhagen came back and talked to us directly after that. And he said that this is going to be wonderful because we're going to change the light structure at the municipal level. And that's because the COP said so and India has to do it. Well, guess what? It didn't happen for 8 years because there was no acceptance of that top-down policy at the very bottom level until the government incentivized public procurement of LED lights, which were going to be cheap. So there are ways that governments can make this work. Public procurement is a real fantastic tool to use to help this work at the very bottom level, but it has to come down to the bottom level. And these regulations don't really work unless you talk people into it. And in places like India, the electoral cycle is very important because at every election, you introduce a new slogan to talk to people, right? And so you start telling them, maybe the last 8 years, the slogan was, electricity, water, and roads. And then it became development and education. Then it became industry. Now, I'm pretty sure during the next election cycle, there will be a talk about renewable energy and how to conserve. All this will happen within the democratic framework. But people have to, the developed world really has to allow us to do it our way because we can do it. And then the adoption is very fast. And now you cannot get a bulb in India unless it's an LED bulb. And it lasts, of course, longer, but...
Here's a tricky question. Maybe you don't have an answer to it.
I'm sorry.
You talked about India, so it kind of gets on my mind a little bit. I mean, obviously, as we go to net zero by a given decade or a given time frame, India is on a net zero 2070 trajectory.
That's right.
Is what you're saying, if we can get the engagement required, if we can think beyond techno-economic solutions, could India move toward 2060, 2050? It's going to be a big problem. As Dan Jurgen said, the math doesn't add up. A major emitter in the world's largest population now, if I understand it correctly, is not signed up for net zero until 20 years post the time in which we pass 2050.
Correct. Well, to let you know, India is the only G20 country that is on the road to meeting its Paris commitments. We are really doing very well on that. So it's better to surprise everybody, and maybe we'll do 2060, but just now we're giving ourselves some space.
Okay. I like that answer. Rolla, I looked at your points, and they were excellent. As you left us the 6 points about decoupling and looking at new options, technological options, cooperation, climate finance, off-grid systems, human resources. Of all the things you've heard, given your broad perspective across the region, did any of it strike a chord for what the MENA region can start with and can do? What was your thoughts? We're going to come back to several questions from the audience, but I know you've got this great perspective across the region. I was wondering if anything really resonated with you.
I think the first thing which we heard it last earlier session, is your pathways. And it's very important. These technologies, they're not substituting. They're complementing the different energy technologies we're talking about. They are complementary to each other to reach a certain goal. So we're not talking about a substitution here, and then the whole mix, every country which wants to transition to net zero will have the whole mix. It's not one or two options, but it's a whole different mix of it, and the economy becomes the feasibility, becomes the driving forces. The second important thing is that population are growing, cities are being built, so we need to look into urbanization with sustainable urbanization. And here where you get the masses and the people and the mainstream engaged, because you're building cities and urban cities in a sustainable manner. And so the perception and the action. And this is why what I started saying about the youth, okay, and the conscious youth. It's very important because they will drive the consumption, where societies are consumer societies. So when you're environmentally conscious, you drive sustainable production also, which also will lead and facilitate in the low carbon emission into it. And lastly, and I think the region is very important in solutions to look into it in a holistic way. This is a region, yes, it's endowed with resources, yes, it's committed to net zero, but also it's a water scarce region. So you cannot come up with solutions that require consumption of water. And this is very key to look into, because water is a very scarce resource and a potential conflict in a region. So solutions to mitigate energy, carbon, and become water utilization and absorption is, I think, needs to be revisited critically. Okay? So we need to expand and look into the region dynamics of its resources. It's not only the natural hydrocarbon resources or minerals, but also its water and its scarcity, and make sure the solution becomes mitigation, adaptation, nexus optimization. And this is where I urge people to look into it, and this becomes the governance of the whole system is very important, the ecosystem and the governance, looking into it, and not to avoid from looking this whole dynamics of it. And I think, and that's what we look into at ESCWA, is the energy, food, and water nexus, and what we call it WEF, into it for mitigating climate impact and getting into decarbonization. And decarbonization is one element, but make sure the solutions are in a holistic and looking into the other natural resources. Your eye is on the water, and don't get up solutions which has water consumption huge into the, because you end up solving a problem, but you're creating a major problem, and maybe it's instability in a region of that things.
Excellent point. So you actually led into my next question from the audience, so you must have seen what I'm seeing here. you brought up, it was going to come to Sassoon, so she can think about it shortly here. The hint is it's going to come about electrolysis, so we're going to talk about water. But you brought up something very interesting. I think we were talking about policy in general and the messaging. The youth, now we have the Gen Z, I think the next generation, Gen Alpha, I don't know what's going to go after that. But reaching out and engaging youth now is far different from what it was many years ago. And so policymakers, taking this as a priority, need to start thinking about this conversation which happens in so many sectors. How do I engage the youth now that are very oriented toward mobile technology, digital technology? That needs to be a convergence in my view. Because I'm at a university, I love the technology part, but I'm asked to go talk on a panel about the youth. I have to go see Gen Z. What are they doing? I'm not Gen Z, I'm too old. But they're doing a lot of stuff that, I don't really care about TikTok and all that, but how do you reach these guys to get the message out? I mean, that's getting to be more and more challenging because the things that they're looking at are changing daily. So that's an excellent point. I think it can't be reinforced enough. But I'll come back to something a little more mundane, just on with the water question with electrolysis. In the region, we are scarce on clean water. How are you seeing this dynamic where we're going to be producing millions of tons of green hydrogen in the region, yet we have challenges with water? Is clean water going to be a problem, or is that something we shouldn't be so concerned about? Because we know that is the nexus that needs to be looked after when we think about transitions. It's energy, water, and of course food and agriculture.
Yeah, actually I echo what Rula already said. It's not solving a problem by creating another problem perspective. That's totally true. Shedding a light in the situation in Oman, do you know that we also produce water when we want to produce oil? Because I just encourage you to attend one of our presentations, will be presented on 8th of February, is that we thought we should sort out a problem, environmental problem, but you have an options. How do you solve it? Do you want just to solve the problem or to maximize on these challenges and to end up by another project? So we have an options that when we wanted to produce 1 barrel of oil in Oman, that you are producing automated 8 barrels of water. That water is very brackish water, very saline water. You cannot just leave it like this. You have to treat it. You have to treat it, or you have to pump it under the ground. So two problems. Either that you use your energy to pump the water under the ground, one option. Second option, you treat it and then you use another type of energy that eventually the water is in a limit that you can throw on the sea. Or you apply a bit additional energy, treat that water, and utilize it. So, of course, there are fourth and fifth solution, but I came from the sector of R&D, so and innovation, and we see the challenge, and we don't want to avoid it. We love to see the challenge, and we love to be challenged to oversee it. There are people who claim that you could produce hydrogen not from water, but I will not shed a light onto it. I will go directly to the question that the electrolyzer in the market not yet upscaled, as far as I know, that to match the demand that we wanted to draw this dollar sign and front it with the kg, that amount of hydrogen we want. So I think the water is one element, the readiness of the technology, the electrolyzer to be there with the big upscaling, it's another perspective. But the technology developers are there and they're working onto it. So answering the question, is the water will be challenging us or stopping us to produce hydrogen? I personally don't think so. If we are already depending on our drinking water from saline water, desalination of the water itself, that means we are automated desalinating the water. Now perhaps the question, is this the optimum way to produce hydrogen, or there is alternative way not to depend on water producing hydrogen, like producing hydrogen from different perspectives? So this is a comment from Sam.
Thank you. Very comprehensive, so I hope whoever asked that got the answer you're looking for. So I very appreciate that. I'll come to the next question that was directly from the audience, and it's one that I would like to answer as well, but I'll start with the panelists. Please let me know which one would like to pick this up as I read it out. What do we envision, or what do you as the panelists, if you've thought about conversation today, envision as the R&D required in the region to advance the discussion today to lead to a well-balanced, fair, equitable, and inclusive energy transition? Anyone would like to talk about where the research and development may fall? And I can give my perspective, of course, but someone like to pick that up first? No one? No? Okay, so I'll give a brief thought on it. I think right now, personally, from what we've heard from, would you like to comment on that too, or? Sure. Okay. All right, well, first I'm picking up on the panelists. I think we talked about the circular carbon economy. This is, to me, now the time in the region where at one point we couldn't have said carbon capture, whether it's from point source or direct air capture, utilizing that carbon for productive purposes, creating hydrogen, whether it's green or blue or turquoise or pink, whatever color you want, makes sense. And now it is the top of the dialogue globally for how we can achieve a balanced transition. So from my perspective, if we start getting into the longer term and saying this is a region where we are extraordinarily well suited to take on those challenges, looking at the future of sustainable aviation fuels, where you have carbon dioxide going to maybe carbon monoxide plus hydrogen, creating fuels for aviation. Hard to decarbonize sectors, amazing opportunity. Looking at low carbon methanol for shipping, extraordinarily good opportunity. Leveraging our resources here to bring CO2 underground, exploit that opportunity, whether or not we're using it from the captured CO2 in country or importing it. These are just amazingly great opportunities, I think, for a longer term agenda. In the very near term, the power evolution here, the power sectors, we've done, at least at Leaf University, not so much on the technologies themselves, like the solar energy and whatever, it's cost effective, but thinking about how you build energy systems. So now you've got to integrate all these very high shares of renewables into a grid. You've got to bring in storage. You have to have demand side management. We have great tools like artificial intelligence now, which people talk about over here and over there, wherever, but you bring that into the mix, and now you can create a very sophisticated urbanized society, which is moving toward the low-hanging fruit of having efficient and decarbonized electricity supply to cities. So this, to me, in the region, we are extraordinarily well set up for R&D leadership in so many areas that I think probably 5 or 6 years ago, I would go places and they would say, what can you do with R&D in the region? Why are you there? You know, these things that we don't do carbon capture and whatever, we have to do other things. Now it's a great opportunity, and the region has led that dialogue. So I'm very excited about that, and I think that's a great opportunity. So I thank you, whoever asked that question, because I had a chance to talk at length, besides asking questions.
You'd like to be a panelist as well.
So now someone has anybody else like to bring in, please?
I think, Steve, in addition to the circular carbon economy framework, which we need to lead the discussion at the global narrative also, not only at research here, but also, as we spoke about, is the catalyzation of the hydrocarbon to sustainable industries. And we need to see what type of industries that the hydrocarbon can catalyze to sustainable industries and move it from that perspective is important. And the third part is we shed light on it, is on the nexus itself. And we need to do more research on the water, energy, and food nexus. The WEF nexus is extremely important as we mitigate climate impact that we need to work on also in that thing.
I totally agree.
Maybe if I can add just a small point. I know I mentioned already one of the critical gaps that we have from a research perspective is the regional disaggregation of IPCC pathways, because this can help policymakers understand, even from a fiscal and budgetary perspective, how much should they be funneling to different technology types within their country. But in addition, I think the research community can help in, I don't want to say humanizing carbon, but I feel like all global trends is based on the demonization of oil and gas and carbon. Of course, we understand the negative impacts from an environmental perspective, but if we do not humanize it, or at least understand its relationship with nature and how we can utilize it to create new sectors, we will not be having the financing streaming into these different R&D, demo, and projects. And when we look at finance, you mentioned international climate finance flows. Even when we think of ESG and we think of different disclosures, automatically the financial sector is considering how they can shift away from oil and gas from the perspective of receiving investment. So if we do not humanize the carbon and understand that its applications can be revolutionary for the climate challenge, we cannot take advantage of those opportunities from an investment perspective. So I think that's really important as well.
Agreed.
Can I ask
Anjit would like to come
question
in.
actually to Rula? You mentioned that as we were moving ahead, we're still a consuming economy. I don't know whether the old model of the consuming economy is really compatible with what we're trying to do. So maybe really people and the younger generation, maybe they really need to think about a new way of living.
Yeah, for sure. That's why we're talking about sustainable consumption, and that's what
Yes.
we're moving towards.
And
this.
that it doesn't seem to me just now any much talk about changing that. It's still a product-based economy.
Anjit, I have a question for you. So since you've asked a question, I'm going to ask a question of you now. So this came from the audience. Under which development, and maybe you don't have to tell me if you know the answer to this, under which development or urbanization scenario do you feel India is now perceived while meeting its net zero pledge? Is it business as usual or fast development and urbanization? Do you have insights on that?
Fast development and urbanization, I think definitely. That is happening just whether we like it or not. It is taking place. And we have to really watch how it's happening. It's very chaotic just now, but slowly, again, what you said about the younger generation is so right, because they're certainly more aware, and not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. They're certainly much more aware of the dangers that are posed by all this rapid change. So I would say, but lots of India, I mean, urbanization is going to happen. We're going to be the most urbanized country in the world, and it's happening at the fastest pace of anybody. So I don't know how it's going to look. I live in a city that is 15 million. And when people talk about a Singapore model or whatever, I tell them, it's as large as my neighborhood. I don't know how we can make these comparisons. It's very hard. I mean, the only country that we have a comparative with is China, and China did it differently.
Yeah.
So we can take lots of good examples and we can have little pilots and maybe expand those pilots. And we are certainly, I find there's a great hunger for good models that can be adopted and adapted to India. So it may not be perfect, but it does work. And public transport is the golden word. Everybody wants it because we've got, like in this region, girls coming out, working. It's fantastic to see. And I come from a city where I'm spoiled. The women are, I can take a taxi at I don't know, 2:30 in the morning, and I know I'm going to get home. But we need to get public transport across the city, and there is a vast metro system that is being built in the country. So there's a great eagerness for this. Yeah. So I don't know how we're going to manage, but everyone is trying.
Well, no, it's a great point. I mean, we don't talk enough about the need. I mean, sometimes we see these stimulus packages pushing electric vehicles and the like, and it's really great if you all want your personal car, but we lose the sight of the need for public transportation, which is not just available, but it's actually something people want to use, right? So it's got to be looked at from the personal perspective as well. And since you were talking about sort of the international flavor, I'll come back to Nora because there's a question for you directly. It elaborates, to elaborate on what you said previously, the Middle East Green Initiative. So the question to you is, how will that initiative, the Middle East Green Initiative, facilitate transboundary regional projects to tackle the impacts of climate change?
So basically, the idea behind the Middle East Green Initiative when it was launched by His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, was this idea that climate change is not something that we can address solely within our country, and there's a great show of leadership that can benefit the region and the world at large. So one of the things that we did within the energy focused initiatives was that we studied the different NDCs of the regional countries. So these are the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. So instead of deciding to design an initiative out of scratch, we looked at the NDCs and we identified the key challenges and barriers that the different countries are facing with their own climate action. And so how can we design initiatives that can directly contribute to their emissions reduction targets? And this is where, for example, the Circular Carbon Economy Regional Forum is to be established as a purely knowledge transfer and technical exchange that can help countries from a technical perspective. One of the things that we also launched was the CCE Fund, which will be investing in different technologies that will help the region. The Clean Cooking Initiative, for example, is looking at going beyond just its climate action, but it's also energy access more broadly. And it has a huge target to reach 750 million people globally. So it's not even just the MENA region, but it's looking at how can we substitute current tree chopping or coal burnt within households for cooking to cleaner fuels, be it LPG or solar, which can dramatically reduce emissions, but it can also help from an access perspective to different countries. So it's looking at their challenges and identifying or launching initiatives that can help address those challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. We have less than 10 minutes left, and so I have one final question I would like each of the panelists to address now that you've heard the entire discussion. And it really comes back to the context of what the whole discussion has been about today. We know that we're trying to advance economic development while addressing climate concerns. You've heard the different options for the MENA region. So my question to you is, what if we're trying to come up with a set of actions of all the things you've heard? What would be, well, first of all, do you think we can do this in the region? And secondly, what action would you like to take first as a priority to push us to the next step? I hate to put someone on the spot to go first, but Nora seems to be pretty good with these quick answers. So Nora, we'll start with you, and we'll go around.
Sure. And also, Steve, as a representative of Gen Z, we're not that scary. But
oh, I mean, it was Gen Z, so I'll have to talk more to her. She knows more. I get the insights now.
But yeah, if I were to identify three elements, I'd start still at the global. I think we have to reorient the global mitigation discussion to be inclusive. And this is not just from a regional perspective. We see many examples outside of developing countries, very much within the developed world of targets, and then backtracking on those targets and going back to perhaps higher emitting sectors because of the lack of infrastructure that encapsulates these different methodologies. So I think we need to use multilateral fora, big political moments during the year to be able to push for the CCE and inclusive climate action more broadly. And I mean, I can think of one key moment. I mean, we have COP28 coming up, and within COP28, we have the conclusion of the global stocktake, which is the Paris Agreement ambition mechanism. So it's going to be a moment for us to all really reflect on whether or not we've been doing well with the Paris Agreement and what needs to be done. So I think that's a really important moment for pushing for inclusive optionality when it comes to mitigation. The second aspect I think is also very important is to streamline or stream investments across all of these technologies. And this is where we need the support, of course, of the research community, but we also need to bring in the financial sector and banks and explain the need for abatement and removal for them to also get their fair share of investments. I think that's very important. And third, which was also mentioned from an awareness perspective, I really think this is low-hanging fruit within the region. Efficiency has the ability to reduce a great amount of emissions, and if you can cater the messaging to be very locally sentimental, you can really get a lot of benefit from this regard. And I'll just mention what we did. I mean, the Saudi Energy Efficiency Center in Saudi had a really huge media campaign a few months ago, and it was with the symbol of a green heart, and it was trying to connect, energy is one of our national endowments, so we should be able to protect it and save it. So it's kind of creating a national narrative that touches the sentiments and supports efficiency. I think that's very important as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was more than one, but that was three. Yeah. That's a Gen Z thing.
So you can skip.
Please, go ahead.
So I think I can go ahead. There is a long-term actions and there is a short-term actions. Taking opportunity that we are here for networking and so on, we could initiate the task force team to a very long-hanging fruit, as my colleague here saying, Noura, that there is awareness, as people are not really aware about all the facts coming from the social perspective. One short-term action that I can see it easily be done is the energy efficiency, and I don't mean by energy efficiency is the building itself, it's even the process. If you review one of the industrial process, you will realize that 35% of things are just moving or consume unnecessary. So if you really develop and improve the process itself, you are somehow contributing towards the decarbonization intentionally, because you are doing this target, the net zero emission. You are not producing green energy, you are just reduce the emission of the CO2. So I think the easiest things we could at least start is the energy efficiency control or management or mapping or improving or developing. And that could be run on a task force level, and then it comes with empowerment from governmental side when it comes to policy and regulations.
I think it's been nicely covered so far, but if I have to add, maybe globally speaking, before getting any policy reforms from abroad, from developed economy, from an emerging markets, to realize that each country has its own incentive structure, and what might work well in some parts might not work in other places. So realizing the domestic needs and different incentives before applying different or the similar policy elsewhere. If I look at from a more micro level, I would choose education to focus on. Not for youth. I mean, youth is the biggest asset. It's been said a lot today. And I think to focus on that, they want to be on board. We know that from university level, higher education. Why not from the start? Why not make it just embedded in the system, in the education system, so it becomes more of a social norm? So focus more on the informal institution part, where all the awareness level can be embedded. And thank you.
Angie?
Thank you. Internationally, I agree with Noura. Thank you for saying that the whole debate on climate change needs to become more inclusive. But just very, very locally, in places like India, again, the reports up to date on things like pollution, a state's pollution report, annual report, are very behind. What we do have now is a lot of data. We're becoming all very digitized. So all the ministries are starting to collect data. And now I think we will get regular, updated data annually. These should be compulsory for every state and every country to pitch into a big global system, so we can really get a good idea about what is the reality, and it will help research, research and development also. So I would like to do that, because when I was researching for this, my own state of Maharashtra, the last time I found a pollution report was 2007. That's very bad. So
Data is important. Dr. Rolla, we started with you and we'll finish with you. What do you think?
Financing. I think, as I said, the region lacked the needed financing to mitigate all the climate action. So, and the region, the financing, it gets the majority of it is debt, while it's highly debted. So we need innovative financing. And we at ESCO are starting working on SDG climate debt swaps, financing donor nexus to ease and increase the liquidity and the commitment on climate action projects on this. And I think the innovative type of financing is very important, and there is need to be worked on for the region. The second point, which is extremely important, and it will have a momentum, is on the loss and damage. And the region needs to be engaged actively on the loss and damage discussion. Okay, so that they don't become the recipient of an outcome, which it's not as preferential. And so I think this is a momentum is coming up, and the region needs to work a lot on the loss and damage discussion and be part of the discussion and the global discussion. The third thing is that when we talk about inclusive transition, energy transition, and this is where I think the rural communities and accessibility of energy is extremely important. And this is where we need to focus also on rural community energy accessibility that we need to work on.
Thank you. Excellent points to close, so I appreciate that.
one last.
All right, we'll let you have one last word, but we're actually getting over time.
I agree with.
Manjeet, we'll let you go, but quickly.
I agree with Rula on accessibility versus usage of energy. That's very important. But also taxonomy. We all have to be able to say that we're talking about the same thing, because the terminologies are also different for different countries and different levels. So taxonomy is very important.
Taxonomy is a great way to finish. So thank you. That's a very good point. So thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you to KAPSARC and the IAEE and the Saudi Energy Economic Association for organizing this great panel. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, panel, for yet another interesting engagement. Now I'd like to invite you all to join us in the second coffee break of the day. And don't forget that there are concurrent sessions as well afterwards. We'll see you there.
Okay. أنا ما أعرفش مين اللي بيلعب فيها. I'm not gonna do it. Can I get?
Morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion titled Carbon Circularity in Diverse Country Contexts. My name is Al-Jawhar Al-Gaayed. I'm a Senior Research Associate in the Climate and Sustainability Program here at KAPSARC, and I will be the moderator for this panel today. So this panel will build on the earlier discussion we had this morning on the circular carbon economy, but that session took a more domestic focus. This one will take it to a more global outlook. So in this session, we hope to identify the progress and potential of the global circular carbon economy transition through the lens of the CCE index. We have a very diverse group of panelists here today representing different regions, including Europe, the MENA region, the GCC, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. The goal of this session is to look at how the CCE framework can fit within these diverse country contexts and regional contexts. So we will start off by looking at the CCE index findings and build on that to guide our discussion for this panel. We will also be opening the floor to questions, so I encourage everyone to engage with our panelists today. So let me begin by briefly introducing our esteemed panelists. Our first presenter today will be Dr. Fatih Yilmaz, a fellow in the Climate and Sustainability Program here at KAPSARC. His current research agenda aims to enhance the understanding of the financial and economic consequences of the sustainable energy transition. Prior to joining KAPSARC, Dr. Yilmaz worked as an economist at the Central Bank of Turkey, as a consultant for the World Bank, and assistant professor of economics at Ada University. Our second speaker will highlight a European perspective. Dr. Kobe van der Lind is the director of the Klingendael International Energy Program in The Hague, the Netherlands. She is also a non-executive director in 3 energy companies, a member of the KAPSARC International Advisory Council, and an energy columnist. She is also managing various studies on European and international energy markets, security of oil and gas supply, and energy system transition. Sharing a Middle East, North Africa perspective, we have with us today Jessica Abeid, an energy policy consultant. She's also a non-resident fellow for the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Jessica draws on 15 years of experience in engineering, think tanks, and consulting in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, to basically contribute to the development of sustainable energy system. Sharing a GCC perspective, we have with us Dr. Abdullah Al-Abbasi. He's a research fellow at the Bahrain Center for Strategic, International, and Energy Studies, Dirasat. His area of focus is the forms and dynamics of renewable and alternative energy. He is also a chartered engineer with over 10 years of experience. Sharing a Southeast Asian perspective, we have Dr. Tilak Doshi, Managing Director at Doshi Consulting and an industry expert with over 25 years of experience. Dr. Doshi held leading positions in the Middle East and Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore, Stansel & Co., KAPSARC, Dubai Multi-Commodities Center, Saudi Aramco, Unocal Corporation, and Atlantic Richfield Corporation. He's also the author of many articles and 3 books on energy economics. Sharing a Central Asian perspective, we have Dr. Dina Azgieleva. She's a research fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Japan. Her research focuses on energy policy, particularly renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy storage. She previously worked as a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore and a fellow at the Henley Business School and the University of Reading, the UK. She also worked as Chief Specialist for Tax Committee at the Ministry of Finance in Kazakhstan. So, as I mentioned, we have a very diverse panel here with us that will be shedding light on these regional contexts. So, without further ado, from here I'll pass it to you, Fatih, to set the scene with your presentation on the CCE index results.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Al-Jawhara. Is it working? I guess. Thank you very much, everybody. As a KAPSARCian, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you in here with us today. In my presentation, the goal of the presentation is to explore the idea of circular carbon economy through the lens of the index we have developed with a team of KAPSARCians, including myself, as well as a bigger team that you don't see their names on the slide here. And the goal of the presentation is to go into diverse regional results. However, in case you were not here for the first session today, where my colleague Tamer has already talked about the framework and the main results of the index, I want to just quickly run through them, but I'm extremely sorry if this is going to be a repetition for you. So let's start with the framework. You probably have already seen this figure. That's the main concept behind this circular carbon economy, moving from linear economy to a circular economy, where you either reduce, recycle, or reuse, or remove the carbon. And so the circle does not generate any additional carbon, however, but basically keeps the carbon within the circle. Based on these 4 pillars, the circular carbon economy concept simply focuses on the energy and the emissions rather than the type of the fuel. So the transition here is not to one type of energy, such as renewable energy, rather the transition here is to basically to net zero. And the idea here basically to give countries a big menu of options where they can select, pick and choose based on their circumstances, regional or country level circumstances. And with the Circular Carbon Economy Index, the idea, the goal that we have is to produce or create a framework, a quantitative framework where we can measure countries' performance and progress. Here the performance really is how countries are currently doing with respect to certain CCE activities or technologies, where the progress is really how countries are doing with respect to, or how countries are positioned with respect to the enabling environments. And really the goal here is not to horse race countries to pick, which one is doing better than other. The goal here is to provide a tool which can be potentially useful for productive policy discussion. And that's exactly the goal of today's panel here with the panelists we have from various regions. So the index has two building blocks. One is the performance score that's coming from basically a country's performance from 8 key technologies. We will definitely like to include more CCE technologies here, but we are bounded by the data limitations. The second building block is the enabler score that comes from 5 different enabling dimensions: policy, technology, finance, business environment, and the system resilience. Well, I don't have time to really go into the technical details behind these figures or indicators here, but one thing that I should probably point out is the fact that all the indicators are scaled by country size whenever it is necessary. So the numbers you're going to see in the results are not bounded or skewed by the country size. The next, we also have an OPL score, or oil producers lens. Basically, given the structural differences of the oil-producing nations, we basically bring additional indicators to the performance score and produce a specific CCE OPL score for the oil-producing nations. So the OPL scores are produced for 28 oil-producing nations, where I'm just going to step back here. The total CCE index scores are produced for all the countries. We have 64 countries in the 2022 edition of the index. We have a quite decent coverage of various regions. These are the 7 World Bank regions. In North America, we have only 2 countries. Obviously, that's not our fault. That's just the geographic result. But other than the North America, we have quite a big of coverage for various countries. Well, I should probably point out, we didn't pick and choose the countries here. There was a principle behind the country selection. One of the main principles was to include countries with at least 1 million population and at least 10 countries from each region, 10 biggest economies from each region when possible. We wanted to include 30 oil-producing nations as well as Arab League countries for the purpose of, given the importance of CCE concept to the GCC and the extended GCC, which is the MENA region. So this is how the index 2022 index results looks like. The CCE index was first put out in 2021 with only 30 countries in the 2022 edition of the index, which was launched last year during the Egyptian Cup in Sharm el-Sheikh. We have 64 countries, and we have a quite decent cross-country coverage, as you can see on the world map. So let me run you through the main results. If you look at the total CCE index results, there's quite a bit of variation across the countries. As you can see, countries at the top, in average, scores roughly 2 times or 3 times more than the countries in the bottom. Let me just help you with, if you can't read the country names. Here are the top and bottom 5 performing countries, and Netherlands is in the 2nd rank. This is for Kobe. So, diving into the building blocks of the index, here is the performance scores, and you have different colors for different technologies. As alluded towards at the beginning, we have 8 technologies, and each technology is basically colored with one color here. One interesting message from this figure is countries at the top have more colors than countries at the bottom, as you can see. So there's definitely a benefit from having from having basically multiple technologies in place that gives countries certain strength with their CCE transitions. Here is the top and bottom 5 performing countries. Now turning our attention to the enablers. In the enablers building block of the index, as we said at the beginning, we have 5 dimensions: policies, technology, finance, business environment, and system resilience. If you look at the colors, and again, there's one color for each dimension. If you look at the colors, some of the colors diminish faster than others towards the end of the distribution. Those are the gray and the orange colors, particularly diminish faster than others. So these are the technology and knowledge. The way we read this diminishing is as the gaps across the countries. And to some extent, we also observe some gaps in the technology, in the policy and regulation dimension. As you can see, the color, the dark blue color diminishes relatively faster towards the end of the distribution. And as usual, the top and bottom 5 performing countries. So let me just dive into the regional results and unpack some of the aggregate numbers to country level and region level to show you within region and across regional distributions. So here is the total CC index scores, average total CC index scores by various regions. These are the 7 regions we have in the index. And the global, which refers to the average of the 64 countries, that sits roughly in the middle. So some regions are doing better than others, but obviously one observation from the figure is as soon as you cross the average, the scores diminishes faster, which alludes towards the fact that the regions like Middle East, South Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, there seems to be some bigger gaps that we need to talk about. So this is a deeper dive into the performance scores, whereas before we have different colors for different technologies, and you have the average scores. Excuse me. So for certain technologies like hydrogen, CCUS, and even renewable energy, you see the colors diminishing faster. Like if you look at start with the hydrogen, we observe hydrogen being utilized at the current level, mostly Europe, East Asia to some extent, and Latin America to some extent, but even in North America, Middle East, and South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't see much green or blue, clean hydrogen basically utilized. CCUS technologies seems to be big in North America to some extent, in Europe and East Asia, but in other regions, we don't see much penetration of this technology. So here, one important note probably we should make is the hydrogen, and hydrogen is an important fuel for heavy transport, where the CCUS is particularly critical for hard-to-abate sectors. And if you think about the hard-to-abate sectors, they are actually more clustered in many developing countries. So we basically need to see more of these technologies utilized in regions like South Asia. If you look at the cross-country distributions within the same region, start with the hydrogen. Hydrogen is mostly utilized in Western European countries, where Eastern Europe or Central Asian countries don't seem to utilize the technology much. And if you turn your attention to the South Asia, it's only 2 countries, Australia and Korea, utilizing that technology a little bit. In Middle East, outside Saudi Arabia, none of the Middle Eastern countries are actually utilizing this technology or clean fuel. Turning to CCUS, again, we have big gaps across the regions. Sorry. And lastly, renewable energy, which has been talked about a lot throughout the COP in many climate change talks these days. Even renewable energy is not penetrated in certain regions. That's the light orange color in the figure. If you look at the South and East Asia, half of the countries don't utilize it or have not scaled it yet. If you look at the Middle East, there seems to be big room to improve. Now looking at the enablers, I'm going to point out, particularly zoom into technology, finance, and policies, as those are the, from the initial figure, as I shown before, those are the areas where the biggest gaps are. So if you look at the technology and knowledge, two key indicators that I want to point out, which is the first one is the clean energy technology pattern. So this is basically knowledge creation we need for the climate change technologies. And the last one, which should be the gray bar, is the international high technology interaction, which is measured by the international trade, including both exports and imports of high-tech products. So basically, one is creation of the knowledge, and the other one is the dissemination of the knowledge. If you look at the creation of the knowledge, that's the orange bars. We don't actually have it much except in Western Europe and some of the Asian countries, such as Singapore, Korea, and Japan. Well, this is understandable. Creation of technology is usually happens in certain countries, but we definitely need to see more of the international spillovers of this technology, where basically I'm talking about the green bars should basically be bigger in all the countries, which doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. Now looking at the finance, there's one particular area that I want to point out. That's the access to sustainable finance. This is basically access to biggest sustainable finance market out there, which is the debt market, including bonds and loans, all sorts of green, sustainability-linked, whatnot, bonds and loans. And if you look at the access, that's the light orange bar. Again, it's mostly penetrated by the Western European countries, where we don't see much of that happening in the Eastern Europe and the Central Asia. In South Asia, there's much of that happened except Singapore, Korea, Australia. In Middle East, outside Bahrain, for instance, there doesn't seem to be much utilization of or access to this critical finance, which has been alluded towards as the important source to finance energy transition. Last but not least is the policies and regulations. Well, if you look at the two critical policies that I want to bring your attention, to your attention, these are the carbon capture and storage policies, where in many countries, for instance, South and East Asia, we don't see much of that orange bar, as you can see. And in Middle East, also outside Saudi Arabia and a little bit of UAE, we don't see that bar much. Which basically, coming to my earlier point about the CCS technologies are particularly important for hard-to-abate sectors, where most of the hard-to-abate sectors globally are located either in South and East Asia or in the Middle East, particularly the oil and gas sector. So the CCS technologies are particularly important in these regions, where we don't see much actually policies in place. Lastly, the climate change policy is particularly not as ambitious as in the Middle East, to some part of the Asia, and also in the Eastern Europe and the Central Asia. Well, just to wrap up, this is my last slide. I want to leave you with these critical messages that hopefully are going to feed our discussion today. The first one is speaking to the first building block of the CC index. If you think from the perspective of CC performance or the key technologies listed under the circular carbon economy, there are significant gaps across countries. One message is countries utilizing more technologies tend to do better in the CC index performance score. And the second point is some of the critical technologies. We have talked about CCUS, hydrogen, where these are particularly important again for hard-to-abate sectors or the heavy transportation, where don't seem to be utilized much in most Asian and MENA countries, despite their importance. Well, these technologies are basically capital intensive, and there needs to be a lot of capital. There needs to be a lot of upfront costs to be displayed, to be put in place. Even some simple technologies, which has been widely talked about as renewable energy, is not penetrated much in certain regions, such as South and East Asia, and mostly in the MENA region. And talking to the enabling environments, some dimensions are particularly important. We have talked about technology, finance, and policies and regulation. On the technology, we need to see more of a spillover, more of the diffusion of the technologies to various regions. In terms of finance, there needs to be a better access, more equitable access, especially for the developing countries. And lastly, the Polish policies for climate policy and the carbon capture policies needs to be more basically ambitious. Those are the points that I want to leave you with. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Fatih, for the very insightful presentation. I think the CCA index results showcases where each region falls within the index dimensions. And I think this last slide shows us or feeds into our discussion for today, inshallah. So, Kobe, maybe I'll start with you. As you've seen, European countries are among the top performers in the index. I would like to hear from you on what are your thoughts on the circular carbon economy approach, especially within the European energy transition context, especially also with the current narratives in Europe around the energy transition.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, my first, when I saw the slides and the performance of European countries, to be honest, I was really surprised. And maybe this is a case that when you prepare a lot of policy making and discussion, my first instinct was quite a lot of it is still only paper. And we were kind of maybe not doing so well when it comes to implementing stuff. Yeah? So countries can be very well advanced, but if I look at the index, it's the promise that if we follow through on what we're saying, that's where we will be scoring, right? And of course, that's exactly where the catch is. I think when it comes to Europe, you see there's different European countries. Some are better positioned than others to make a move. Has a lot to do with the space in their national budgets they're willing to generate, because it's not just private finance, it's quite a lot of it is public finance. That's why I was so surprised that the Netherlands all of a sudden came out this way. So if you think of it that way, then the Fit for 55 and maybe even the Repower EU puts a lot of pressure, puts a lot in place. But there is some drawbacks from that, because with the European policies also comes quite a lot of intervention on exactly how you have to realize it. Just give you an example. I saw we scored in Northwest Europe, you score very well on hydrogen. That's all still unabated hydrogen. Yeah? There is plans and there is possibilities, but maybe you've heard, there's also other issues in countries why an investment doesn't materialize, which has to do with nitrogen from in the Netherlands. So the Portos project, which was supposed to be already up and going, is still awaiting permission. And I think that, and so if you look at the Northwest European, so it's like the part of Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, 58% of current hydrogen demand is there. Then one of the Commission's proposals in the Fit for 55 and trying to increase ambitions is to have 50% of the industry use of hydrogen transferred into electrolysis hydrogen. That's an awful lot of hydrogen. Yeah? So we're not there yet on, even though we have first FDI on a very big electrolyzer, it still needs to be scaled up quite a lot. And then with these, I mean, it depends a bit. So in certain areas, you might actually score very well based on the Fit for 55. And what I really like about the index, that if we look at what the starting position is, also within certain regions, and specialities which economies have, then maybe Fit for 55 could be just kind of made a little bit lighter, not in ambition, but in avenues how to get there. Because I think that would really improve the speed with which we can get from paper to actually doing something. And I think, you know, sometimes my sense is that we want to put so much pressure on the system that you can also go too far in terms of pressuring the system that companies at some point, because there is also some competition going on now with the Inflation Reduction Act, that for some companies it might be a bridge too far. They're not allowed kind of an intermediate solution, and therefore they think they may fail. And so maybe the index should also be read as that if you allow countries to come in their strength, that actually maybe you can get a better result. So turning paper into action. So that, and of course, you asked me what the current situation, and I think if this score was done based on the policies and numbers of Fit for 55, not the Repower EU yet, and we've done very many things as short-term policies where the fuel switching didn't really help our score if you would do it on 2022 numbers. So it's showing that the current energy crisis is actually, you know, taking quite a lot of it back, that it's, we can't follow up on it. So, and I think here in Europe the diversion might actually grow because of the energy crisis. The abilities of countries now to step to the plate and actually continue with it is becoming more divergent. Some countries may be able to speed up, others definitely will not. So there is now a big debate in Europe going on. There is some fear that the simplicity perhaps, or the assumed simplicity of the Inflation Reduction Act shines much better for industry than the very complicated, incredibly all-encompassing Fit for 55, which, you know, you need a year to study and read everything in order to understand what your task is. So maybe the good outcome of it is that when other regions are stepping up and coming up with their plans, that it is a reflection, learning from what they bring to the table and how they want to approach it, to understand that maybe you can have some very positive takeaways from it, that it might help your system to do the right thing in this as well. So my sense is always that Fit for 55, I like the ambition, I don't like the bureaucracy that sometimes comes with it. So we need to find a middle way how we can get from writing it up into doing, and maybe that next step is going to be hard. So I really would like to have an invitation for you to invite me on 2022 numbers and show how the EU has fallen back in the score, to show that in order for us all to do this well, the resilience, the resilience score, I looked at it, you know, we might have to look at the definition there, in terms of how resilient are you that you can stay with the program in this. So it's really enlightening and making us understand what to look for, but also realizing that in order to live up to this beautiful presentation on behalf of Europe, that might be a task that is a little bit too hard for us to follow up on. So, but yes, I mean, it is really enlightening, and I think it's an open invitation to Europe to actually start implementing some stuff. Thank you.
Can I just add one sentence? We usually get people question like, oh, well, why my country is scoring so low? And that's kind of the provocation that we want to have in this index, so we can talk about why. But your approach is different. It's why my country is scoring so high, and that's also a good provoke.
Yeah, but I think it's a problem of both, that we need to understand each other's scores on what we do well and what we could improve on. And that's the beauty of this comparison, that we can actually, it's a very honest mirror to what we do. We shouldn't just only boast. We shouldn't only be depressed about what happens and what happens not, but we should actually take a lesson. Hey, you see, because you surprised me, the outcome was much better than what I see on the ground, yeah? So I could have just taken it and run a victory laps with it. I think it was a signal, hey, now we have to translate it into doing, yeah? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kobe. And coming from the highest performing country, I think we should definitely engage Kobe more with the index. We have a lot to learn from you.
I think if they allow me to go on to the definitions and to be a little bit harsher on my country, I think we will come down a notch or two, yeah.
We'll take it offline. She's on the committee, technical advisory committee, so we'll take that offline.
Thank you, Kobe. So Dina, maybe I can ask you to also reflect on the CCE index results, especially in the context of Central Asia. How do you see the CCE potential in the region, and what are the necessary tools you think that will help scale it up?
Thank you very much. Excellent question. Yeah, I highly enjoyed learning about CCE this morning and this session, and I also checked website. I was very happy to see that you actually included Central Asia, because I know including Central Asia is sometimes challenging due to lack of data and the language barrier also, so that's great. And you included Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and also Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is not actually Central Asia, but we can count it as well. So I really like that you included index, because even someone will look at your website without knowing very much English, right? This is the problem. Central Asia, we don't speak English so well. So even if government will look at your website who has not so good English, and if it doesn't need to have good background in energy, because it's index is very simple. That's the main advantage. Anyone can understand it. It's simple. You don't need to know language. And you can compare countries. You can compare regions. That's what advantage of index, I think. And I think countries would be interested to see, for example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, where are we relative to each other? Because hard to compare Central Asia to European Union, right? We wouldn't. So it's nice to compare what's happening in the region and what is regional average, where my country is comparing to other countries in the region, because we are similar. And also Fatih said that this is a nice tool for policy discussion and planning. I think not only for government, but also for like foreign investors, for whom will be very hard to go to all these policy documents without language, and it's time consuming. So this is like a good website also for foreign investors and also for public awareness. So people also can see where their country is on CCE. I also like that this website is very transparent, so every indicator actually very well explained and the data source clearly written. So whoever say why my country index is high or low, they can click and see all the details where data coming from, because KAPSARC does not create data themselves, so they pull data from many, many different sources and create the index. So this transparency, I think, is great. Then you don't have to deal with all these questions, right? And for government, it will be very time consuming to go to all these different sources on internet, right? You got data from World Bank, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, IEA, so many data sources, some of them not free. Some of them might be not so user-friendly. So you pull them, they're doing all this hard job. So for people just to see a very visual illustration of where country is located. Yeah, for the scaling up, so I think the countries you're probably planning to expand the region, right? Like Central Asia, there are many more countries. And then for Central Asia, you can create even, for each region, you can make region average, right? So then we can see, for example, Kazakhstan relative to region average, or Uzbekistan relative to region average. And if you're considering improvement of this website, when I used my mobile phone, I got this message saying, you're not using all the features because you're using mobile phone, you better go to desktop, right? So if you're considering to make it friendly for mobile phone, or even making it up if you have spare funds. And also, because probably this is great initiative, and I think everyone should know about this CCE, your website, your platform, it's great. And in order to disseminate it, maybe you can make a competition, like essay competition or policy brief competition, where people from different countries can write on their countries using this data and show how they analyze and give policy implications using this data set. And you can make a price for them, small price, something. Yeah, that's my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dina. Jessica, I know that the MENA region has varying local contexts within it. But what do you think are the current energy transition gaps in the region, and how can the CCA approach be useful in that context?
Yep. Sorry. First, let me specify that we're speaking MENA countries without, is this better? MENA countries other than GCC countries, of course. And as you said, they're not homogeneous countries. They do not have the same energy context or local context. But there are common trends we can witness, which I'll talk about. In terms of CCE framework, the focus is mainly on carbon reduction, which is mostly in the deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency measures. But I want to specify, although all countries do have targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency in their nationally determined contribution as part of their climate commitments, renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets are mostly driven, the main drivers behind them are mostly energy security and economic concerns in these countries, in MENA countries, because net energy importers, of course, have this incentive that they want to reduce imports of energy. Their budgets have been strained, especially when oil prices are high. Net energy exporters, however, have the incentive that they want to export more, make more revenues, so they also have an incentive to implement renewable energy, reduce domestic demand. So that's very important. However, there are so many challenges. If we look into how the energy transition is happening, more or less, we see that the focus is mostly on power generation. There's been so much more focus on buildings. Transport is still not there. There are so many plans, but it's still lagging behind. Also in renewable energy, also we're way behind targets as well. But the focus has been on power and only on power generation, which leaves a lot of gaps, especially in terms of transmission distribution. We implement all this renewable energy in areas that are far away from load centers where people need this electricity. We're implementing variable renewable energy, which is mostly wind and solar, which adds a lot of stress to grid flexibility and stability. So a lot of flexible systems, grid stability and expansion needs to be done, energy storage. A lot of these are not there. A key challenge as well is that we still have an unsustainable increase in power demand. If we look into the average across the MENA countries, we see that the annual growth rate in electricity demand averages some 8 to 10%. The global average is 5%. And we also see that this is also driving a race to add power generation. A lot of it is thermal. So we also have the growth rate on average for capacity generation addition per year is around 7 to 10%. The global average is 6%. So we're adding a lot of renewable, we're adding a lot of thermal capacity as well. We're not doing enough on the grid. Energy efficiency is gaining traction, but also we need a lot more of this. How much time do I still have? Because I can go on forever. We have the issue of subsidy, and the major issue is how do we finance all our plans, our targets across MENA countries, because even in net energy exporters in MENA countries, we still have a lot of macroeconomic risk, political risk. We have uncertainty, low access to finance, non-bankable projects that need to be resolved.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That's very insightful. Tilak, if you allow me, we can maybe jump to Abdullah, because I mean the GCC is part of MENA, and I think maybe the conversation would be more relevant here. I mean, although the GCC is part of MENA, but it's definitely a different set of economic profiles and country contexts. So, and many GCC countries have already set their net zero targets, including Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So, from your point of view, what are the key enabling factors that are currently being implemented or should be implemented, either through the CCA approach or other, to achieve these targets, and specifically through the CCA approach?
Yes, Thank you for this question. I think it's very important to highlight on the successful story, and I think carbon, circular carbon emissions indicators, it's something we have to be proud of it. It's that developed within the region, and because if we see the landscape of the priorities or the strategies or the commitment, international commitment to the region, we will find that we have so many things on our plates. We have net zero emissions, we have renewable energy, energy efficiency targets, sustainable development goals. All these initiatives are let's say, somehow it's come from outside the region. Even the circular economy concept, even the circular carbon emissions is based on circular economy, but it's actually developed to be more aligned with the challenges of the region. And what I like about it also, it's focused more about the energy and emissions. And this is very important things to highlight here. While circular economy is based on material, and because of its base of material, it's required a lot of investment to be integrated with the cycle of production. While if you are going to the energy and emissions, it could be one of the cycle, so that it could be easily integrated within the system. However, we have also our own challenges. One of the challenges related in the GCC related to the fear of change and how it's the institutional structure are not willing to adapt these new concepts. And not just that, if we have any change on cabinet or ministry, we will see 180% change in the policy. So I always I will always support the concept of deep states, while I think our European colleagues don't like us, American colleagues, they don't like the concept of deep states because they thought that it will manipulate the willingness of the people. But I think in our states, we are very stable countries from political perspective. So if we can structure our deep state to support the best interest of the government or the best interest of the people, that it will be something we have to rely on. Because what we see when any political change, we see shift from one side to another, and that we don't need that. We have now strategies, we have a plan, we have to stick to it. And we have to put the procedures and policy to enable the growth of these initiatives. The second thing also we have to highlight it here is related to how we can make the carbon, circular carbon indicators or target to be more aligned with the business model in the region. Because the question of course it will always arise. If we are talking about environmental commitment, if we are talking about any change, the cost, it will be always there. And it's always not good to formulate the policies to be supportive by economic perspective, to be supported and to be covering the whole context from regional perspective. So it's always good to link it with the business model and to utilize the comparative strategies and comparative thinking in that. And that is very important because we need to have these indicators or initiatives to be more aligned to the human nature. So human nature is based on how to be competitive. We have need, we have to develop ourselves, and we have to invest in that. So if we are able to structure something to enable all these initiatives in one context, that will be great. Last point I would like to highlight, and it's also in the presentation, it's the lack of innovation and R&D. We have a lot of discussion regarding R&D in the GCC, especially that I am coming from research institutes. And my view on that is even if we allocate billions of dollars to support R&D in the region, we will not succeed. Because it's not about expenditure, or it's not about the number of patents, because there are millions of patents. It's about how we structure the right ecosystem to manage the knowledge chain from education, from R&D, from industry. And then it's retained back to this whole cycle. This is the missing piece in the region. So we need to invest in R&D, but R&D, it has also be connected to the educational system, to the industry, and to find the right ecosystem, it's a challenge. And we have to invest a lot in that, and we have to think in that. And if we have the same issues with the same challenge related to changing the policies and priorities, we will not reach anywhere. So just to end up, I am optimistic that we will be able to that, but to be optimistic, you have to be realistic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdullah. I think you raised a very interesting narrative shift around the deep state, which is interesting. I think what also resonated is the need for a business case or a need for an economic case to apply CCE. And I think this has also been addressed earlier this morning in the first session around CCE. I think there was this whole case for having industry champions to lead this transition through showcasing CCE technologies. So back to you, Tilak. From a South and Southeast Asian perspective, how do you see the current position of the region in the index, and where do you see the highest impact for the CCE potential there?
Yes, it's a tall order. You know, there are 10 countries in Southeast Asia, ranging from Singapore, one of the richest countries in the world per capita, to poor countries like India and Vietnam, and middle-income countries like Indonesia. Vast differences in sizes and populations. So necessarily my comments will be more macro and general. But depending on the country, so for Indonesia, deforestation is a major issue. So, you know, natural sinks are important, and how they use the ability to capture carbon through natural sinks. A country like Singapore, for example, they've been the first Southeast Asian country to price carbon, and is starting low, but by 2030, they expect per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, they expect to have something like $40, $50. So they're quite aggressive in their targets. And then you have India, which its nationally determined contribution to the COP process promised a net zero by 2070. Now we all know what when governments promise targets 30, 40, 50 years away, one should have a healthy dose of skepticism. But let me come back to the index as such. We've got India at a GDP per capita PPP basis of 2,200, 2021. We got Germany at 51,200. Enormous difference. And of course, India is number 45 in a list of 64 countries on their performance on carbon, the circular economy, the index that we're talking about. And then you got Germany at number 3, right? But what do we see in Germany today? They are going back to coal. They are burning wood to survive the winter. They're going around the world looking for LNG, because the entire 2 decades of green policies was all was supported by cheap Russian gas. It's easy to shut your coal mines and your nuclear if you can import nuclear from France and import gas from Russia. So, it's not a criticism on indexes. Indexes do tell you certain aspects. But if you don't talk about GDP per capita, then most Asians are not interested. Because when you know, 1/3 of India's population probably consumes per capita energy less than a US refrigerator. So for us to talk about India reducing carbon footprint when they don't have one, it's like John Kerry flying his jet plane to Davos and telling the rest of the world to decarbonize. So it is a bit of an elephant in the room to talk about decarbonization in a context where countries need to develop, where people are poor and thinking of their next meal. And Arvind Subramaniam was the previously was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. He wrote a very well-cited piece in the Financial Times, and he entitled it Carbon Colonialism. He was objecting to the fact that the World Bank, the IMF, the UN specialized agencies, the EU, are imposing pressure on poor countries to not use fossil fuels when we know from the time of the Industrial Revolution that human betterment depends on fossil fuels. If you do a correlation analysis between fossil fuel use per capita and GDP per capita, you probably get a R² of 90%. So to tell developing countries not to use fossil fuels is unconscionable, I would think. When the Western countries have 200 years of fossil fuels and enjoy a higher standard of living, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Indonesians and the Vietnamese are saying, we want to develop too. We want to have color televisions. We want to have a higher standard of living. And why are we stopped from doing so? So I think the elephant in the room is economic development. And talking about carbon, reducing carbon to developing countries is a rather difficult concept to handle for most people. I'll end with one point as an economist looking at CCE. There was a famous joke in the Soviet days. During May Day, the Politburo would be there, looking at the tanks going down the main road, the main parade square in the Kremlin. And so the tanks go through, the infantry goes through, the sailors go through, and then the last contingent is a group of guys wearing black suits and bowler hats and carrying a briefcase. So this guy says, "Comrade, who is talking to his friend when they're looking at this parade, right?" So this is how the joke goes. He says, "Who are these people?" Then this other guy, his comrade, says, "You are looking at the most powerful, destructive force of the Soviet Union. They work for Gosplan, the Economic Planning Ministry." Okay? So the point I'm trying to make here is that if CCE becomes an instrument of bureaucrats and academics telling economists what to do and telling planners what to do, it's a slide to socialism, and I don't think it's going to help anyone. But if CCC is meant to reflect market realities where you put a true cost of carbon, then the incentive structure automatically leads to achievements of the carbon goals that we want. So then the real question is, what is the social cost of carbon? And there's a wide debate in the economic literature about the social cost of carbon. The Biden administration wants to put it at $50. Some economists would say the social cost of carbon is negative, that in fact CO2 is good for us because it leads to greening and it allows developing countries to grow. So there is a wide range of opinions on carbon capture, on renewable energy, and so on. I'll stop there, but I wanted to point out the elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tilak. And I think what sets the CCA apart is that it's a framework that acknowledges that each country will have its unique, specific energy transition. It's a technology agnostic framework. So it allows for the tailoring based on the unique country and local context of that country. So maybe we can move to questions now. I'll start off by, so what time is it?
Can I, if time
Yes,
permits,
absolutely.
can I add one point
Yes,
on
absolutely.
this? And actually, I wanted to mention this on MENA countries, why the cost of least developed power systems is very high in terms of carbon emissions. If we look into post-conflict or conflict countries in MENA region, we see that they do not have a performing power sector, maybe a lot of power shortage, and this comes at a huge carbon footprint because they rely on expensive and pollutant diesel generators. So also part of development and reforms falls into sustainability, and reducing carbons is a way forward as part of reforming a lot of these sectors.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Kobe, maybe I can address this question to you around the theme of collaboration and CCE. In what ways you see collaboration in the CCE framework important in the European context and in between countries in the European context and also between the regions we covered here today?
I think it's I think it's really vital that we're going to cooperate, because we already talked about the diffusion of technology that is needed, more investment in emerging economies to also access these investments without, I think, getting to the colonialism bit, but if you have joint projects. And I think quite a lot, I mean, if you look at the index, and if I just make it reflect on Europe, actually quite a lot of the technologies will also rely on foreign investments coming into development in order to realize their goals. And you can actually, if you think about the riskiness of new value chain building for investors, then as Tilak so nicely pointed out, I guess the resilience and the energy security score was we should have a look at it again. But we can actually be meaningful to each other. That if, for instance, in this country, we can, because there is a very good combination of wind and solar possible in order to start, for instance, hydrogen carrier value chains, then that sort of investment cannot come to the market if you don't have some demand guaranteed. That's particularly important in the beginning. So that's where I think Europe can play, if it really wants to come through on its policies and promises. For a while, it was very much an internal discussion. Obviously, Northwest Europe should also seek out the opportunities close by in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, across the Mediterranean with North African countries, but also further away, because it's not, because there's not one solution. So it is like looking at each other, but also trying to guarantee supply and demand. So you have to think of this as becoming inclusive in when you try to realize these things. And the inclusiveness is that you cannot do this alone. Not one company, so we will need companies that are willing to collaborate, create new ecosystems. We need countries to collaborate, and we have to build new, longer-term relationships in order to realize that. That's not the world that we see at this moment, because it seems like everyone has all sorts of opinions about a lot of things. But I do think it's vital for, so if I would say Fit for 55, that can only succeed if we include all these countries around us too. And maybe any change needs a first mover. Yeah? The first mover takes quite a lot of risk. Yeah? And if you want to help other countries, then rather than go into colonialism, what you should do is take upon yourself the risk, understand that you're going to have some costly failures, but you're doing other countries a big favor. We've seen that with wind, the development of the wind industry, yeah? Where Germany invested quite a lot of money, and the reason why the Netherlands, I think, is scoring so high, because based on that development, we could build twice the wind for less money. And so we need to understand these dynamics better, that we need each other to develop. And you can't possibly, Europe cannot possibly develop on all the different scores that are in the index. We're going to rely on one country or one region specializing, bringing us forward in one thing, and another region in another thing. And I think if we don't understand that, I think it's the index is going to show diversity in the wrong way. Yeah?
Thank you so much, Kobe. Very insightful. Maybe also building, you want to add?
Yeah, just want to give a quick example to that cooperation between Germany and Kazakhstan, for instance. Kazakhstan declared the biggest green hydrogen project last year, 20,000 megawatt equivalent. That was a joint actually project with Germany, supported by EBRD and a Norwegian company. So that was quite a big of a collaboration that we were actually talking about.
Thank you, Fatah. So I have a lot of questions here, but I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, if there are any. I think we've highlighted a bunch of very interesting points today. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. Okay, please introduce yourself and who you're addressing the question to exactly.
You have two. Also, Adnan.
I'm Martin Wilhelm. I'm not sure who my question is to, maybe Fatih, but the question is, how does carbon leakage relate to the CCE index?
Can you raise your voice a little bit, please?
I'm sorry. Yeah. How does carbon leakage relate to the CCE index? What I mean by that is, obviously we know there are certain countries that were able to export a lot of their carbon emissions, either to countries that manufacture a lot of goods or countries that produce a lot of fossil energy. And so if the countries that are exporting carbon emissions tend to be among the much better ones in the index, and the other way around, is that related to the fact that in those countries that actually produce a lot of carbon emissions because they import other people's carbon emissions, I'd say in theory, being really good at the CEC index would be much more important, but in practice it's a lot harder, and partly because of the carbon emission exporting countries. How does that relate to how you interpret the results? Because I think it's sort of a similar conclusion to what Tilak was saying. I think the way this index should be used is maybe not to encourage everybody to get up as quickly as possible in the index, because this may be easier and more appropriate for certain countries and much harder or less appropriate for other countries.
Thank you. Fatih, would you like to take this, or Kobe?
No.
Sure, I can probably start. I mean, Martin, you're getting, this is a very good question. You're getting into the, scope levels, basically, scope 1, 2, and 3. So Germany doesn't produce, let's say, a lot of high carbon intense, like cement maybe, but import all that stuff from maybe India. India and China alone produces half of the world's steel and cement consumption. So in India and China, we see a lot of carbon happening, or intensive carbon intense in industries. So the index, the current structure of the index does not obviously account for this. But what we would, for instance, expect to see happening in the index is, given the carbon border adjustment mechanism now implemented in Europe, European companies are not, I mean, European citizens are no longer going to enjoy this. So they are going to have to do something about it. They will probably, you know, European companies who have their factories located in India or China, we expect them to go and invest in CCUS, for instance, and probably account for some of that, or maybe invest in some sort of carbon development of the carbon markets, or purchase some sort of offsets for the scope 3, for instance, if they cannot, you know, eliminate that. So within the main structure of the index, that is not being captured, because we specifically did not want to go into the carbon accounting in this index work. We wanted to stick to the technologies and the energy technologies and the activities. We specifically did not want to include carbon accounting in here, because then carbon accounting is something output. That's the way we see it. That's the output of the process, not the inputs in the process, where we wanted to focus on the inputs more. But nevertheless, the mechanism should be captured within the indexes. It should go through the interaction of the two countries. That's my quick answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatih. So we have another question from Dr. Adnan.
And then we have another one there.
In the front row and here. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, thank you. I very much enjoyed the panel, and I would like to address my question to my friend Talik. I really appreciated your...
Dr. Adnan, can you just put this...
Yeah, I appreciated your perspective, my good friend Talik. And I kind of thought about it, and I want to ask you a question related to my comment in an earlier panel in the morning, and see what you react to it. In the morning, I made the comment is that when you have a pollution, serious pollution problem, you have to do two things. You have to stop polluting, and you have to remove what you have polluted for. And I think in this particular case, what India and other Asian countries are saying is that give us more space, because we haven't polluted much. We need more space, we need more time. But that space and time, when you look at the total world, has to be compensated by something else, because we are facing a potential catastrophe. I mean, everybody will be affected. So would you agree or not agree with what I've suggested, is that we have to, on the one hand, move perhaps at different pace to stop pollution. So India will probably, instead of 2050, reach net zero by 2060 or 2070. That would be okay, provided those who put a lot of that pollution in the atmosphere, they can take a good part of it, not necessarily all of it. Because if you do that, you will reach the same target, but in a different pathway. And that was our discussion earlier. So I'm curious about your reaction to this proposition, because unless this proposition is put on the table and discussed in the COP28 and COP29 and coming to a solution where everybody is happy, it's not an antagonism, it's not either or. We have to all to come to a solution. And that may be one way of looking at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adnan. Tilak, if you want to take this.
Thank you, Adnan. I fully agree with your premise and your position, and I did hear your comments yesterday when you made this. There are a couple of provisos that I would add. One is, what sort of pollution are we talking about? In a developing country, pollution could be cholera because of dirty water, to cooking using wood and cow dung in the kitchen. So those pollution problems are real, and they should be attended to as quickly and as vigorously as possible. But these pollution problems are the real problems of sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, sulfur, that sort of, those are the pollutants that actually have got an epidemiological and health impact directly. Now, the CO2 is not a pollutant by the exact definition of the word pollutant. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Now, I think the main narrative is that CO2 is a single control knob that controls the global temperature. Now, there's a debate on this. If you read Stephen Koonin's book, Unsettled, that certainly is not something that all scientists agree to. And by the way, scientists agreeing doesn't mean anything. Science is not consensus, science is disputation. So with respect to, so I agree with you fully that pollution needs to be stopped and needs to be stopped vigorously. For example, supporting poor households with subsidized LPG so that they can have clean cooking at home and not poison themselves with burning wood inside the house. Fourth generation coal power plants, which are ultra super critical, low emission, high efficiency. Now they cut back all the pollutants, everything except for CO2. So because CO2 has become such a single force that is defining the entire narrative of Western approaches to the environment, that, you know, that there is real debate. If you look at the work by William Happer, Princeton physicist, Richard Lindzen, physicist, these are all very highly credentialed physicists, and they don't particularly buy this focus on carbon dioxide alone. So those are my personal views. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I read these guys, and I know there's a debate. So I agree with you completely that we should get into controlling pollution. But the CO2 is a separate global warming issue, and there is debates to be had on that. I think we still need to debate on the global warming models, because if you've seen some of the IPCC stuff, out of the 102 global warming, global climate models that they track, they're all overheating. So when you backcast for the last 30 years, their projections of global warming and the actual data on global warming determined by satellite data is much lower. So do we define our destiny? Do we invest our hard-earned assets in developing countries on the basis of climate models that are hypothetical, based on hundreds of assumptions? You know, if I were a policymaker, I would be very hesitant to put the livelihoods of my country's people on the basis of speculative, what I consider to be speculative global warming models.
Thank you, Tilak. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I took a bit.
If you allow me,
Yes.
I think NASA made a measurement of the temperature and CO2 emissions, and it's published in NASA. So the global temperature is rising with the accumulative CO2 emissions. I'm not talking about theories or something. I am talking about something tangible. So I think it's not the time to reinvent the wheel, because the science and its CO2 emissions is one of the leading cause. There are other emissions which is severe, but the accumulative on the number of the emissions, which is CO2 emissions globally, it's affecting the human directly, and several studies shows that. And as I referred to, you can Google NASA website to see the correlations between CO2 emissions and global temperature. And last year it was the hottest summer in the entire history of the world. So there is something happening here. I mean, there's something happening, and we have to acknowledge that. Second point, if you allow me also, when we are talking about net zero emissions, that means we are not cutting the emissions. We are providing, we have the emissions, and we have corrective measures, which is working in agriculture, several projects related, which will, at the end of the day, it will be zero emissions by you have emissions and you have measures to absorb these emissions. So I think other countries, all the countries have to work in two directions. And actually studies now shows net zero emissions is not the solution of climate change. We have to go to negative emissions, which means the measures should be more than the emissions itself. I think it's a very critical topic, and we need actually to be certain about several facts in that matter.
Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes until we wrap up, so I'll take that one last question here. Yes, there, please. And whoever is going to address this, we would like to finish on time, please. I know people are tired.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Eduardo. I'm originally from Brazil. I have a question and a comment.
Okay.
Where's the question?
Who are you addressing the question to?
Anyone.
Okay.
So my first question is related to the index. Is that how do you balance and account for the competing interests between energy transition, energy security, and energy justice? Because priority might change. If you are in Europe, if you are in Africa, if you are in Asia. My comments now relate to the index. Very interesting. I find it very illustrative. However, I want to see just a point of fairness. You see on your slides when you show the graphs, you see a tendency that Africa, and sometimes not necessarily Latin America, is also on the bottom. However, if you look at, for example, in terms of energy, who are the companies that make most of the money in Africa and South America? Where they come from? And then where are you accounting? Because most of them tend to be North American, European. And then the question is that they are polluting, making the money in those countries, and actually they're not accounting for that with their dividends and the money they make back to where they are. And actually they've been doing historically investing in the minimum to extract gold, mine, actually timber, oil and gas. Don't invest in infrastructure, don't invest in renewable in those countries, don't invest in CCS in those countries, and they get the credit for the countries that take most of the money who helps their wealth. Is that fair?
Thank you so much for the interesting question. Fatih, you have 1 minute. If you'd like to address this in 1 minute, please. And then we can take this offline, definitely.
Sure. I probably need to write a book, actually, to answer that question. Let's try what I can do in 1 minute. Well, the index currently obviously does not, you're talking from the perspective of energy trilemma index, where it speaks to the trilemma. You have the energy equity, security, and access. We do have an enabling system resilience, energy system resilience. That's the last part of the enabling dimension, where we actually account for countries' access to energy, energy infrastructure, and that sort of things, which is going to affect countries' current positioning or how they are positioned to accelerate their transition. But speaking to a lot of the details, FDIs, investment companies, dividends, we probably need a book to answer that question. But at the end of the day, what we are doing in the index, I guess we should not expect a lot from an index to solve all our problems. The index here is to just give you a snapshot. If you are not happy to put on the same figure a developed country and a developing country on the same figure, then we should simply put developed countries within their gangs and the developing countries within their groups, and look at the situation from that perspective. Today we have shown you regional perspective, and that's why we put countries within the same region on the same figure. See my point? But definitely the goal here is to provoke a discussion. Exactly you saying, why did you put Singapore and India on the same figure? They are not the same. That's exactly what we want to do, provoke you, so we can talk more and what Singapore is doing different than India, and you know, that's how the conversation goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatah. I think this brings us to the end of the session, and I think we end it with more questions than answers, perhaps, and I guess this is the idea behind having a conference. I think this leaves the participants and researchers here with questions to maybe further explore. I would like to thank the audience and the esteemed panelists for enlightening us today with the very specific country context that they shared. And I wish you all a nice evening.